This recording is being made of the life of Miss Anna Norris. She was born in Buffalo, Missouri, moved to the state of Oklahoma in 1889, the city of Ardmore in 1890. Her father was with the First Federal Court here. The present date is April 10th, 1956. The recording is being made in the home of Miss Norris at 722 North Washington. Now, Miss Norris, could you tell me about your first year as a teacher? Could you tell me something about your students, the number?
It is. My first school was in what we call the Banks Building in the southwest city, about 4 blocks, I would place it about 4 blocks south of Main Street on B Street. What is now B Street on possibly C. Hard for me to locate that from what's built over there now. And I had the second and third grade, about 30 pupils, as I remember it. And of the people in Ardmore today who attended that school, I can only remember one, that's Ernest Jameson, was a pupil in my third grade at that time.
Were your students just from Ardmore, or did you have any from the outlying districts out in the country?
I think my pupils were all within the limits of Ardmore at that time.
Well, what about the length of the school day when you were teaching?
We began our school at 9 o'clock in the morning, closed it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with an hour's intermission at noon.
Did you have any type of recess for the lower grades?
Mid-morning and mid-afternoon, we had a 15-minute recess, I think it was.
What about your lunches? Weren't you were teaching in the first public school? Did you have any lunch program, or did they bring their own?
Children who lived too far to go home and get lunch within that period of an hour brought their lunch. They ate usually in the room in which they studied.
Well, could you tell me something about the faculty of the school where you taught?
Our principal was a professor, I would call him Professor Smith, S-N-I-F-F. I don't even remember his other name. And I think possibly he was not in the schools after that year. Good principal, however. Mrs. Nanny Berkshire was the first grade teacher, and Miss Lula Harding, who is now Miss Lula Juhan, who is now Mrs. Harding of Dallas, was the 4th and 5th grade teachers. And I guess Mr. Smith must have had 6th, 7th, and 8th, as I remembered it, because we did teach to the 8th grade then in our elementary schools.
What subjects did you teach, or did they teach in the school as a whole?
I suppose principally we taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. But, of course, at that time we brought in some elementary science and elementary teaching of that kind, but always within the reading period. And I came as a very inexperienced teacher, just out of college. But Mr. Hendricks was the superintendent of our school then, and I want to say to his credit that his attention and kindness to me made me a much better teacher than I would have been. He was very good. And a superintendent in those days was possibly more helpful than a principal today, because he was over the entire city, and yet there were only, I think, less than 20 teachers within the city. So we got to all of our schools quite often.
What about your school board? What jurisdiction did they have?
I beg your pardon?
What did they do in the way of helping the schools?
So far as I personally know, they hired the teachers. But I remember 2 members of the school board, Dr. S.S. Carr and George Bruce. Then I think Mr. Banks was at one time while I was here, and I.R. Mason were members of the school board. Others I can't remember now.
Do you know if they made any rules for the school system as a whole to follow?
They made very strict rules as to the behavior of their teachers. We were not permitted to attend dance. We were supposed to be, they supervised us a good deal like we supervised pupils maybe in this day, I don't know. But they kept tab on our social life as well as our teaching life. I never heard of a teacher being dismissed because she did any of these things, yet if she did them, she kept them quiet.
I see. Well, how was the school financed?
I think the Curtis Act passed by Congress, I believe in 98 or 9, enabled the territories to levy taxes for the maintenance of public schools, and that was the act under which our schools were organized. Now, I think the first year of our schools was 1899, and I began my teaching career in the second year, 1900.
Could you tell me any of the names of the other teachers who were on the faculty with you?
At different times?
Yes, or under you when you were principal.
Well, I went to the, what we call the Collar Avenue School, a little two-room school over in the southeast of town on my second year, and I went as the principal, but I just had one other teacher. There were two of us. The other teacher was Miss Ethel McGee. And from there I came over to what we called the Friendly Building, a frame building on the northwest side of town, now where Franklin School is, and we had 4 teachers. Miss Essie Gibson, who is now Mrs. Cannon, Miss Bradford, Dorothy Hardy's mother, Miss Fanny Walker, and I were the teachers.
Well, do you know what qualifications were necessary to become a teacher then?
I do not.
They didn't have...
For my qualifications, they took my college diploma. And I do know teachers who did not have a degree, so that wasn't required. We took no... In about the 4th year of my teaching here, I took a teacher's examination. That's the first teacher's examination I'd ever taken. And that was entirely for the local teachers of Ardmore, or those who wanted to be teachers. Carried on and graded and everything by the superintendent of the Ardmore schools.
What about the pay of the teachers?
Big. I got $40 a month. But oh, how many good clothes I could buy with $40 a month.
Mrs. Norris, would you tell me some of the events and things that happened to you while you were principal after 1901, I'm sorry.
Well, I became principal in 1901 of a small school, as I have said before, and then in 1902 I went over to Friendly. The summer after my first year at the Friendly School, each ward school building was built, a brick pen-room building, I suppose, with 2 rooms in the basement and 4 rooms on each floor, all duplicates. And one of which I was principal was named Franklin School. Then I began what I considered a real career as principal of schools, because I had 9 teachers that year. I can remember some of the teachers that year. But, of course, in my mind, they're mixed up with the many years that I was principal, and I can't always name which year they belong to. So I'll not attempt to name any of my first teachers. But it was We were all very proud of our big schools because of our little schools we had, and it was a very pleasant year's work. I don't even remember who was superintendent when the new schools were built. I cannot place the superintendents as to the years that they were here. But it was a delightful school work, and we had 300 or 400 pupils in the Fourth Ward School that year. 300. And I went back there for 3 years. Each year, school grew a little bigger, I believe. I had Mrs. Grace Carr was one of my teachers during that interim. Mrs. Selvage, whether it was that interim or later, I don't know, was one of my teachers. Margaret Bagwell was another. My principalship then was broken off for 3 years that I taught in Colorado, coming back to Ardmore in 1908 to the same Franklin School in the same position. By the way, salaries had grown a little better in the meanwhile. And I had Mrs. Morgan, first grade teacher, when Miss Luss and Mrs. McCullough. And in the years of my principalship, I can't tell you just where, we did work in a system of competitive athletics to a degree. We also had supervisors in drawing. We called it art in those days. And Miss Leslie Woods, later Miss McCullough, was our art supervisor. We also had music supervisors. And so our system was growing all the time, developing more and more into a real city system. All during those years when we graduated children from the elementary school, which was graduation from the 8th grade, we put on a common program, all 4 buildings in one program. And tried to make it very elaborate. And worked ourselves to death with it. Then they went from there to the high school. Of course, I could mention lots of names of boys who went to school to me. Fred Tucker, and Luther Randall, Mort Woods, George Norris, and
could you tell me some of the duties you had while you were principal?
As principal of school, I had the duty of supervising the entire school, seeing the playgrounds were supervised, and the teachers were living up to their assignments, making all reports, taking all instructions from superintendent, seeing the building was kept in order by the janitor, teaching the 8th grade.
What about your grading system?
We graded entirely then by numbers. The system was that the month's work sent out report cards every 4 weeks. I believe it was a new report card every 4 weeks, and one they brought back and forth. And it was done in figures. Some got 90 and some got 90 and a half. Everyday work counted for 2/3, and examination tests or test papers counted for 1/3. 70 was supposed to be a passing mark, I believe. Kate Galt so nice was one of my teachers.
Do you remember any unusual incidents either among your students or the teachers and students?
I remember once when our physical culture classes, and Mrs. Carr was the supervisor of our physical program at that time, and we had drills, gymnastic drills, and Jack Blakemore was in my 8th grade at that time, and his grandmother happened to be one of the judges of the athletic contest. Of course, we drilled very hard, and we were good, but I never did believe we really earned the first prize, but Jack and his grandmother got it for us. I remember also a time when my 8th grade boys decided at noon they would go into the office and hide from me. So when school began, the boys' seats were all empty. In the meanwhile, they had locked the door and couldn't unlock it, and they couldn't get out, and I didn't know where they were. So I continued my school until 4 o'clock without an 8th grade boy. And when school was out, they made a noise, called to me in the hall, and that's where they had been all afternoon, and couldn't get out. Of course, I tried to punish them, but I didn't very well. They thought it was a joke, and I had to take it as such because it was impossible to have done otherwise.
Did you have organized fire drills or
yes.
something like that?
The bell, we had a gong at the one end of the long hall on the upper floor just outside my door. The janitor was privileged to give the drill, the alarm, or I was. But the janitor always told me if he was going to do it. So one morning in the midst of the class, the alarm came on, about my knowledge. We all went out of the building, and I looked and looked for the fire. There was none. But Goldie Bowman thought it would be a great joke to turn it on, and we had our fire drill. Goldie was quite a favorite of mine, so it was all right.
Did you ever have any epidemics of whooping cough or measles or...
Not too any alarming. We had, of course, occasional. Children missed for them, and some children stayed out for fear of them. But our school was never depopulated while I was there. I think later when flu came on, but nothing like that ever occurred while I taught in Ardmore. My last 3 years were under Mr. Hendricks, and 3 years under Mr. Hendricks was equal to 3 years in a teacher's college to make a good teacher. Not Mr. Hendricks, beg your pardon, Mr. Evans. Now can you erase that? Okay.
Mrs. Norris, I'd like to thank you for helping us make these interviews. This interview has been made by Peggy Smithwick, senior in Ardmore High School, April of 1956.